I wasn't even invited to my grandfather's funeral. I showed up anyway, and the lawyer pulled out a letter that turned the tables. Subscribe if you want more real stories about family and legacy. Write in the comments where you're watching from. I always knew I didn't belong. Not in the Carter family. Not in their world of tailored suits and brandy-soaked boardrooms. Not in their hushed drawing rooms, where conversations were currency and affections, if they existed at all, were locked behind decades of etiquette and generational expectation. My name is Evan James Carter, and at 35, I had come to terms with a quiet life that rarely intersected with theirs. I taught literature at a liberal arts college just outside Boston, led seminars on Keats and Baldwin, and drank my morning coffee from a chipped mug in an apartment where the radiators clanged like anxious ghosts. No private chauffeurs. No trust funds. No family photos on magazine covers. But I had my books, my students, and a certain kind of peace that, while imperfect, had kept me afloat since my early 20s. I didn't come from nothing. Technically, I came from them. My mother, Laura Carter, was the youngest of Archibald Carter's 3 children. She had been the rebel before I inherited the mantle. She married a musician, my father, James, and that alone had been enough to earn her banishment from the gilded rooms she was born into. She died when I was 15, taken by ovarian cancer in a slow, cruel decline that no one in the family seemed to register beyond a terse condolence note or an obligatory bouquet sent through their assistants. After that, my father and I drifted further into our own quiet orbit, and eventually he too passed, his heart giving out one spring morning while tuning a guitar. By 22, I was alone, except for my grandfather. Archibald Carter wasn't an easy man, but he was a man who paid attention. In the wake of my mother's death, he reached out, not publicly, not with any grand statement, but with a handwritten letter. It was 3 lines long. Laura was better than all of us. Come visit. Sunday's work. And I did, for more than a decade. His house on Brookline Street stood like a monument to another era. 3 stories, brick facade, iron gate that squeaked no matter how often it was oiled. The interior smelled faintly of tobacco and old paper, and his study, lined from floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes, became my sanctuary. We would sit for hours, talking about everything and nothing. He read my college essays, asked my opinion on Whitman, criticized my tendency to rush endings. He never praised, not directly. But once I saw a copy of my published article on Faulkner's moral ambiguity tucked among the books on his shelf. That was enough. My relatives never understood that relationship. They didn't try. Uncle Richard, the eldest, ran Carter Holdings with all the charisma of a python in a glass case. He spoke in quarterly forecasts and dividend yields, and he viewed my career as a mildly embarrassing detour in an otherwise streamlined bloodline. His wife, Aunt Marilyn, collected causes and pearls in equal measure. I could never tell which she valued more. Their sons, Kyle and Derek, were a matched set of ambition and smirks, forever flashing white teeth at benefit galas while shaking hands with senators. They made sure never to tag me in family photos, and I made sure not to be there to be tagged. They knew me as the quiet one, the one who turned down internships, the one who didn't ask for help, the one who wore sweaters instead of cufflinks, and didn't network over golf. I didn't belong in their orbit, and I didn't want to, but Grandpa did. He told me once, over tea and silent rain tapping against the window panes, "You know, Evan, everyone assumes money is a measure, but it's just a magnifier. Whatever you are, greedy, kind, small, noble, money will make you more of that. You, at least, came by your character honestly." I didn't know what to say to that then. I just nodded. The last time I saw him alive was a week before his death. He looked frail, thinner than I remembered, but his eyes still held that piercing clarity. We sat in the garden, brittle sunlight touching his pale knuckles as he poured tea from a cracked ceramic pot. He talked about an old fishing trip with my mother, how she used to challenge him in debates about art versus commerce. She was right more often than I admitted, he murmured. When I rose to leave, he pressed a worn leather-bound copy of Marcus Aurelius into my hands. "If I've taught you anything," he said, "it's to trust your eyes and not the applause." I didn't know he wouldn't make it through the week. If I had, I might have stayed a little longer, asked more questions, told him that he mattered to me. He passed in his sleep, quietly, with no fanfare. I found out from Margaret, his longtime housekeeper and, if anyone cared to notice, his truest companion in his final years. She called me just after dawn. Her voice shook. "He's gone, Evan. I thought you should know." By the time I arrived at the house, the family had already come and gone. The driveway bore tire marks of polished luxury sedans. Inside, things looked off. The grandfather clock in the hallway was missing. The study, usually cluttered with maps and miniature ships, had gaping spaces on the shelves. A few of his medals, he had served in Korea, though rarely mentioned it, were no longer on the mantel. Margaret didn't look surprised when I asked. "They started taking things the night he passed," she said, eyes low. "Said they were preserving memories, but it felt like scavenging." The funeral was held in a grand cathedral uptown. I wasn't asked to speak. They seated me behind cousins I didn't recognize, near the door. Richard gave the eulogy. He spoke about legacy and structure, mentioned stock performance and philanthropy, but said nothing of his father's wit or love for poetry. No one spoke of my mother. After the service, I stood alone by the marble steps, watching the family cluster for photographs. Marilyn adjusted her hat. Kyle laughed with a city councilman. No one noticed I was there. I returned home to my apartment, exhausted. I made tea I didn't drink and opened the leather-bound book my grandfather had given me. Inside the front cover, written in his elegant hand, were 6 words. "If they erase me, remember me." I didn't sleep that night. And yet, nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. The following afternoon, I was grading papers when my phone vibrated. A message from Kyle. "Meeting with Harrison at 10 a.m. Don't mention to Evan." And then, seconds later, "Sorry, wrong thread." I stared at the screen, the words blurring. Harrison, as in Walter Harrison, the family lawyer, the man who had handled every Carter legal affair for the last 30 years. My stomach turned. They hadn't invited me to the reading of the will. It shouldn't have surprised me. I'd long been erased from group emails, party lists, family announcements, but this felt different. This wasn't forgetting. This was deliberate. I sat at my desk as the city moved around me. Horns honked. A child laughed outside. Somewhere, a dog barked. But all I could hear was the echo of my grandfather's voice. "Trust your eyes, not the applause." I didn't know what to expect. I didn't care if he had left me anything. But I knew with bone-deep certainty that I was meant to be there, that he had intended it, and I wasn't going to let them pretend I didn't exist. That night, I laid out the navy ghoul suit I wore only for lectures and funerals. I polished my shoes, ironed my shirt, packed the copy of Meditations into my satchel, and set my alarm. Tomorrow, I would walk into that office uninvited, unwelcome, unwanted. But I would walk in all the same. The morning air felt thick with anticipation as I stepped outside. Even the usual clamor of the city, car horns, the distant shriek of subway brakes, the low murmur of pedestrians, seemed muffled, like the world itself was holding its breath. I caught my reflection in a nearby shop window as I passed. Navy suit, clean shave, shoulders squared with a determination I didn't entirely feel. There was a hollow trembling in my chest, the kind that accompanied moments of irreversible change. Walter Harrison's office was housed in one of those stately old buildings on Beacon Street, the kind with wrought iron balconies and ivy creeping up brick walls like green veins. I'd only been there once, many years ago, when I was a teenager accompanying my grandfather to sign documents I didn't understand. Now, the brass letters on the glass door read Harrison and Associates, Estate and Legacy Law. Inside, the lobby was quiet and richly furnished, the air infused with the scent of leather and lemon polish. A receptionist glanced up with polite curiosity as I stepped in. Her eyes flicked to the gathering in the adjacent waiting area, then back to me. "I'm here for the reading of Archibald Carter's will," I said. My voice was calm, firmer than I expected. There was a pause. "Your name?" "Evan Carter." A slight flicker passed over her features. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition? She nodded and gestured toward the others without another word. They were all there. Uncle Richard stood near the window, stiff-backed and pacing in measured strides. Aunt Marilyn perched on a velvet-cushioned chair, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, though no tears were visible. Kyle and Derek leaned against opposite walls, thumbs dancing on their phones, whispering occasionally with smirks that didn't reach their eyes. A few lesser-seen relatives filled out the cluster. Second cousins, spouses, perhaps even one of those lawyers who only emerge during times like these. The moment they saw me, the atmosphere shifted. Richard stopped mid-stride, his gaze narrowing. "You weren't invited," he said flatly. "I know," I replied. "I came anyway." "You're not listed," Kyle added without looking up from his phone. "This is a private meeting." I felt the heat rise to my face, but I stood my ground. I'm his grandson. I have every right to hear his will. Marilyn straightened, her voice laced with condescension. "Let's not make a scene, Evan. This isn't the time." I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, a door to the left of the room opened, and Walter Harrison himself stepped out. His hair was thinner than I remembered, silver now rather than gray, and he wore his age like a well-pressed suit, controlled, deliberate, dignified. He surveyed the group, then looked at me. "Evan," he said, nodding once, "glad you could join us." I heard someone scoff behind me. "I wasn't on the list," I said quietly. "You are now," he replied. Archibald was very specific. Richard took a step forward. "Walter, there's been some confusion. Evan wasn't supposed to be here. We've already discussed most of the distribution informally." Walter arched an eyebrow. "Well, I suggest we let the will speak for itself. If everyone would please join me in the conference room." The room was paneled in dark mahogany and filled with the faint scent of old paper and cedar. A long polished table stretched across the center, ringed by high-backed leather chairs. We filed in slowly, the tension a silent guest among us. I took a seat near the door, deliberately distant from the others. Richard sat directly across from me, his eyes hard. Kyle leaned back with arms folded, exuding disinterest. Marilyn sniffled and adjusted her scarf. Walter sat at the head of the table, adjusting his reading glasses before opening a leather-bound folder. For a moment, the only sound was the faint rustle of paper. "Before we begin," he said, looking up, "I want to make clear that I was not only Mr. Carter's legal counsel for over 3 decades, but also a personal friend. We met regularly. I am fully confident in the clarity and intention of this document." There were a few tight nods around the table. Derek sighed, barely disguising his boredom. Walter began, "I, Archibald Francis Carter, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament, revoking all previous wills and codicils." He continued in a measured voice, reading through the legal formalities with a calm that only heightened the tension in the room. I felt my pulse hammering in my neck. And then the room shifted. After careful consideration and thorough observation of my family over the past several years, I have reached a decision regarding the distribution of my estate. I hereby bequeath all my property, real and personal, including but not limited to my primary residence at 17 Brookline Street, my vacation property in Vermont, all financial accounts, investments, personal belongings, heirlooms, and intellectual properties, to my grandson, Evan James Carter. Silence. For one suspended second, no one breathed, and then chaos broke loose. Marilyn gasped, her tissue fluttering to the floor. Kyle straightened in his chair, his phone forgotten. Derek swore under his breath. Richard slammed his palm against the table, making the glasses tremble. "This is a joke," he spat. "A mistake." Walter didn't flinch. "It is neither. Your father made his wishes very clear." "He was manipulated," Richard snapped. "Evan poisoned his mind." "I'm afraid that claim won't hold," Walter said evenly. "Mr. Carter underwent 3 separate evaluations by licensed professionals in the months leading up to this will. All confirmed his full mental competency. And he wasn't himself, Marilyn cried. He was confused, vulnerable. He barely remembered things. That's not true, I said quietly. All eyes turned to me. He remembered everything. Richard's gaze was pure venom. You think you deserve this? You think after the way you disappeared from this family? I didn't disappear, I cut in. I was pushed aside, forgotten, but not by him. Walter held up a sealed envelope. Mr. Carter left a personal letter to accompany the will. Evan, it's addressed to you, but you may share it if you wish. My hands shook slightly as I took it. The envelope was thick, the handwriting familiar. I broke the seal and began to read silently. My dear Evan, if you're reading this, then the battle has already begun. I wish I could spare you from it, but I trust you'll endure. You always have. I know this will come as a shock to the others. Let it. For years I have watched their behavior, not just towards me, but towards one another, towards you. They were never cruel outright, that would be too obvious, but they were indifferent, transactional, dismissive. You were the only one who never asked me for anything except my company. You never angled for inclusion or recognition. You showed up and you listened. You saw me as a person, not a relic or a vault. That is why I chose you. This isn't a reward, Evan. It's a responsibility. One I believe only you are equipped to carry. Grandpa, I folded the letter and placed it in my lap. He saw who we were, I said aloud. All of us. Marilyn stood, her face pale. He was old. He didn't understand the implications. He was never meant to. To what? I asked. Make his own decisions, choose who mattered to him? Kyle's voice cut in, sharper than expected. We won't let this stand. There are legal channels, courts. This isn't over. Walter nodded solemnly. Of course. You're welcome to pursue litigation. Just know that Mr. Carter anticipated that. He retained full documentation, audio recordings, visitor logs, item inventories. We also have notarized witness statements confirming his intentions. The silence this time was heavier. Richard looked like a man watching the floor vanish beneath him. This is theft, he muttered. No, I said, this is justice. Walter cleared his throat again. There is one more stipulation. Any personal property that has been removed from Mr. Carter's estate prior to the reading of this will must be returned within 30 days or legal action will be taken. Marilyn visibly recoiled. Kyle opened his mouth, then closed it again. Walter turned to me. Evan, we can discuss next steps in private. There is, of course, much to arrange. I stood slowly, my legs steady beneath me now. Thank you, I said. As I walked past the stunned faces of my family, I didn't feel triumph or vengeance. I felt the weight of everything my grandfather had handed me. The home, the legacy, the burden of truth. And somewhere beneath all of that, the faintest spark of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a very long time. Belonging. I left Harrison's office that day with the letter still clutched in my pocket like a lifeline, the scent of old paper and my grandfather's handwriting fresh in my mind. I didn't look back as I stepped onto the sidewalk, though I could still hear the faint shouts behind the thick wooden doors. The spring breeze hit me like a curtain lifting, and I realized that I had been holding my breath the entire time. I inhaled slowly, my lungs filling with something that felt strangely like clarity. I had thought the reading of the will would bring closure, a kind of solemn finality, but it was only the beginning. By the next morning, the backlash had begun. My phone buzzed before sunrise, pulling me out of a restless sleep. At first, I thought it was my alarm, but it was a text, then another, then a voicemail. The screen lit up with names I hadn't heard from in months. Richard, Marilyn, Kyle, a few distant relatives I didn't even recognize. The messages started politely enough, though the words were carefully sharpened. Evan, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Let's talk before this goes any further. Then came the more forceful ones. You may want to reconsider how you proceed here. This won't go well for you. And then the threats. This isn't over. By the afternoon, social media had caught wind. I didn't know how. Perhaps someone had vented to a journalist or a leak from within Harrison's office. But it didn't matter. The headlines appeared like smoke. Carter family rift. Black sheep grandson inherits entire fortune. A photo of me from the college website accompanied one article captioned, "Surprise heir." I hadn't spoken to a reporter, but that didn't stop them from speculating. The comments were a mess of assumptions, insinuations, and thinly veiled contempt. Some called me lucky. Others called me manipulative. One particularly cruel thread accused me of preying on a senile old man. I shut off all notifications, changed my number, deleted my social media accounts, but the damage had been done. That week, the calls extended beyond me. I was called into the dean's office at the college, where I taught a course on modern American literature. The dean, a thoughtful woman named Linda Cho, offered me tea and a furrowed brow. "I've received several emails, Evan," she said carefully. "Allegations, nothing substantiated, but you understand how this looks. We're not making any judgments, of course, but some of our board members have expressed concerns." I nodded. I couldn't even muster anger, just a tired nod. "I may need to take a leave of absence," I said, "to let this settle." She hesitated, then offered a tight smile. "That might be best." Later that evening, after I returned to my apartment, I sat alone at the kitchen table with my grandfather's letter open again beside me. I read and reread the words until the lines blurred. "This isn't a reward, Evan. It's a responsibility." I wanted to believe I was strong enough to carry that weight, but each hour seemed to chip away at my resolve. I hadn't even set foot in the house he left me. I'd been too overwhelmed, too consumed by the backlash to grieve. 3 days later, I finally went. The house was both exactly as I remembered and completely changed. From the outside, it still held its dignified charm. Brick walls warmed by the sun, the curved iron gate creaking familiarly as I opened it. But inside, the air felt hollow. There were gaps on the walls where paintings had once hung, empty spaces on shelves. The heavy globe from his study was gone. His war medals, even the small bronze statue of Athena he kept on the mantel, gone. Room by room, I discovered more absences. The antique clock that chimed softly every hour, the leather armchair he always sat in by the fire, the blue and white porcelain vase from Kyoto. Not valuable to anyone outside the family, perhaps, but to me, they were parts of him. In the upstairs bedroom, I found the jewelry box that had belonged to my grandmother. It was nearly empty. I sat down on the edge of the stripped bed, the springs creaking beneath my weight, and stared at it for a long time. The drawers had been rifled through, the satin lining stained with age. A lone earring rested in one corner like a forgotten thought. I don't remember how long I sat there, but when I finally rose, I began searching more deliberately. Every room, every drawer, every closet. I wasn't looking for things. I was looking for something. Some clue. Some answer. Some sign. I found it in the back of the walk-in closet in the study, behind a false panel I didn't know existed. A small safe. I should have guessed. My grandfather was always meticulous. I stared at the keypad and took a deep breath. Then, almost without thinking, I punched in the numbers. 6,191,928. His birthday. The light blinked green. Inside there was a stack of journals, a bundle of USB drives, and a folded piece of paper with my name on it. For Evan. Use if necessary. I sat down on the floor right there, cross-legged like a child, and opened the first journal. His handwriting was neat, almost architectural in its precision. The entries were dated, organized by month and year. They weren't reflections, they were records. Visitation logs, names, times, summaries of conversations. Richard came today, talked for 7 minutes about my health, then 45 about transferring assets. Again. Marilyn brought me lavender soap I didn't need. Stayed 12 minutes. Left before tea. Told Margaret I was becoming too delicate to make decisions. Kyle and Derek haven't visited in 4 months. Called once last week. Wanted to confirm I'd spoken to my accountant about the lake house. Each page was the same. Observations. Documentation. a slow, methodical catalog of abandonment. And then, on a page marked 6 months before his death, Rachel came upstairs while Marilyn distracted me, 20 minutes unaccounted for. After they left, I noticed the tennis bracelet was missing. I filed the photographs. They may not realize the new cameras captured the upper hall now. I closed the journal and exhaled. He had known everything. I took the USB drives and the note and went home. It was nearly midnight when I finally opened my laptop and inserted the first drive. Folders appeared, named by date and content. I clicked on one, labeled Testament Videos. The first video opened with a timestamp in the corner. There he was, seated in his study, wearing a navy cardigan, the lighting warm and soft. "My name is Archibald Francis Carter," he began, eyes steady on the camera. "Today is September 15th, and I am recording this with full knowledge and mental competence." He continued, explaining his decisions, his observations, his motivations. He detailed specific conversations, betrayals, omissions. He referenced documents, journal entries, even photographs. At one point, the camera shifted to show Walter Harrison, seated beside him, confirming the date and mental clarity. I watched 5 of the videos that night. Each one was damning, calm, reasoned, irrefutable. He hadn't just chosen me. He had built a fortress around that choice. The next morning, I called Harrison and told him what I'd found. He listened quietly, then said, "Bring it all in. I want to see it." I also reached out to a litigation attorney he recommended, Sarah Donovan. I met her 2 days later at her office, which overlooked the harbor. She was in her 50s, sharp-eyed and direct, and within 20 minutes of reviewing the materials, she looked up and said, "Your grandfather was the most thorough client I've ever seen." We got to work. Cease and desist letters were drafted and sent to each family member known to have taken items. A detailed inventory was compiled using my grandfather's photos and journal entries. We filed an affidavit with the probate court requesting enforcement of the will and the return of all personal property. At the same time, Richard's team filed suit contesting the will, citing undue influence, diminished capacity, coercion. Sarah smiled as she read it. "They're predictable," she said, "and sloppy." We responded with a motion to dismiss, attaching the medical evaluations, the recorded videos, and the journals. Sarah submitted sworn statements from the doctors who had assessed my grandfather. We also obtained testimonies from Margaret and the hospice nurses, confirming my regular visits compared to the rare appearances of the others. And then the harassment turned cruel. Marilyn began calling the hospice center where I had volunteered for years, implying I had been unstable, unprofessional. Richard sent letters to the college board accusing me of elder abuse. Kyle posted a public blog implying I had isolated a vulnerable old man. But we were ready. Sarah sent formal notices of defamation. Harrison followed up with official letters threatening legal action. Margaret provided documentation. Video files were compiled into exhibits. Then came the real breaking point. Sarah called a family meeting. "They may need to see it all at once," she said. "Let them understand just how cornered they are." The meeting took place in her office. I arrived first. One by one, they came. Richard, flanked by his attorney, Marilyn, tight-lipped and pale, Kyle and Derek looking uncertain for the first time in their lives. Sarah didn't waste time. She dimmed the lights and played the first video. "My name is Archibald Francis Carter." The silence in the room was absolute. Marilyn covered her mouth. Richard went rigid. Kyle shifted, visibly sweating. After the 5th video, Sarah turned off the screen. "There are 12 more," she said. "We will release them one at a time during litigation unless we can reach a resolution." No one spoke. She handed over the itemized list of stolen possessions. "Failure to return these within 7 days will result in criminal prosecution." Still silence. Then Richard's lawyer leaned over and whispered in his ear. Richard finally spoke. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "we've been hasty." Sarah smiled. "That's a start." When I returned home after that meeting, I stood for a long time in the front hallway, my hand still resting on the doorknob, the sound of the key turning barely faded. The house, my grandfather's house, now legally mine, was quiet, but it no longer felt haunted. It didn't creak with accusation the way it had after the reading of the will. The air, though still heavy with memory, had shifted somehow. The war was not over, not entirely, but the tide had turned. I could feel it. In the following days, deliveries began arriving in steady waves, not from relatives themselves, but through moving companies, anonymous couriers, or unmarked trucks. Items returned without words, without explanations. My grandfather's medals, tarnished but intact. The antique globe, now slightly scuffed at the base. The painting of my grandmother he kept over the fireplace. A box marked miscellaneous arrived one morning with the blue and white vase from Kyoto, his favorite fountain pen, and the Athena statue wrapped in dish towels. There were no notes, no apologies, just silence. I cataloged each piece meticulously, comparing it against my grandfather's inventories, checking dates, photographing their condition. Sarah handled the legal confirmations and closed the file with the probate court. Richard formally withdrew his lawsuit. Marilyn's attorney issued a statement of no further dispute. Derek sent a terse email asking if we could move on. Kyle remained completely silent. In the calm that followed, I finally allowed myself to breathe. I began cleaning the house with care, not with the urgency of an intruder or the fever of grief, but with the attention of someone beginning to take root. I dusted shelves, aired out the attic, and opened windows that hadn't been unlatched in years. The scent of spring seeped into the curtains. I placed the returned items one by one where they belonged, not just where they had been, but where they should be. I reshelved books in the study, arranged framed photos on the hallway table, hung my grandmother's painting once again above the fireplace. The house slowly stitched itself back together. It was during one of these quiet mornings, while reorganizing my grandfather's desk drawers, that I found an envelope I had somehow missed in all my earlier searches. It was sealed with wax and labeled in his unmistakable handwriting, "To Evan, after everything is settled." My breath caught as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, written with the kind of precision and clarity that had defined every conversation I had ever had with him. My dear Evan, if you're reading this, then the storm has passed. Knowing our family, I imagine it was a Category 5 hurricane, but I trust that you've weathered it. There is something I didn't want to include in the legal language of my will, something I felt you deserved to hear from me directly, not through documents or attorneys. This inheritance, it was never about punishing the others. I know they believe that. Perhaps they always will. But this was not vengeance. It was recognition of who you are, of who you chose to be. You possess a heart that does not bend toward power, a mind that asks questions instead of making demands, a spine that straightens in silence rather than in noise. You are your mother's son and my grandson, and I saw in you the one person who might understand the truth of what a legacy actually is. Money will tempt you to become someone you are not. Let it become a tool, not a trap. Use it to make space for good work, for reflection, for generosity. Build something lasting, not of walls, but of moments. Remember that the measure of a life is not what it accumulates, but what it offers. I love you. I believe in you. I always did. I folded the letter with trembling hands and placed it in the small wooden box where I now kept his journals and the flash drives, the last archive of who he had been, beneath the image the world had crafted of him. In the weeks that followed, I began the work of reshaping not only the house, but my future. I took a formal leave of absence from the college. Linda had been understanding, supportive even, but I needed time to think. I needed silence. I walked the neighborhood each morning with a notebook, jotting down ideas without purpose or expectation. I returned to the lake house in Vermont, his favorite retreat, and one he had refused to sell no matter how often Richard brought it up as wasted capital. I spent 2 weeks there, clearing branches from the dock, repainting the shutters, fishing in the early hours of the morning. At night, I sat on the porch and read aloud from his journals. letting the echo of his words reach the trees. That was where the idea came. A foundation, not in name only but in function, a living legacy, something built not to honor his wealth but his quiet, deliberate kindness. I called it the Archibald Carter Trust for Dignified Aging. The mission was simple: to support elderly individuals with no family or insufficient care, people who, unlike my grandfather, had no one left to fight for their wishes. I established a board, reached out to social workers and community health professionals, and began identifying grants and partnerships. The trust funded end-of-life planning services, in-home healthcare subsidies, and legal assistance for seniors trying to protect their homes from exploitation. I used a portion of the inheritance to create a scholarship at my former college, the Laura Carter Fellowship, for students pursuing social work, hospice care, or geriatric nursing. The work gave me purpose, not revenge, not redemption, purpose. The rest of the family predictably faded from direct contact, but small gestures began to appear. Marilyn sent a Christmas card, her cursive still pristine, though the message inside was brief. Your grandfather would be proud of the foundation. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't love, but it was, perhaps, a beginning. Derek emailed 6 months later to ask if I might allow him to visit the lake house once. He remembered fishing there as a child and said he wanted to bring his own son. I agreed. When they came, I stayed out of the way, letting him walk the grounds in silence. When he left, he shook my hand. We said little. Kyle never reached out. Richard, as far as I knew, still carried the grievance like armor. Sarah had hinted that he was involved in another lawsuit, something to do with misappropriation of client funds. I felt no triumph at the news, just a quiet sadness. And yet, new branches of the family began to grow. At a community event hosted by the foundation, I met Lucas, my grandfather's nephew, whom I had heard about but never met. He had moved to California decades ago after a falling out with Richard. He was soft-spoken, warm, and full of stories about my mother I had never heard. We had dinner the following week. Then, again, he introduced me to his grown daughters, who had only distant memories of Uncle Archie. In time, they became a kind of chosen family. 1 year after my grandfather's death, I hosted a memorial dinner at the house. Not the grand reception Richard might have planned, not the stiff photo op Marilyn would have orchestrated. Just a long table in the garden, surrounded by people who had truly known him. Margaret came, bringing his favorite pear tart. Walter Harrison and his wife arrived with a bottle of wine he had once gifted them on their anniversary. Lucas brought photographs. Derek came again, alone this time, and sat quietly at the far end of the table. Marilyn declined, but sent a bouquet of lilies. There was an empty chair at the table, left intentionally. After dinner, as the sun slipped behind the trees, I stood and raised a glass. To Archibald Carter, I said, not the executive, not the public figure, the man who read poetry before bed, who took tea at 5 o'clock, who taught me to question everything and to remember the quiet truths. There was a stillness that followed. Not silence, exactly, just reverence. That night, after everyone had gone, I stood on the front porch watching fireflies gather in the dusk. I held his last letter in my hands. The ink faded slightly from frequent reading. What will remain? Not the lawsuits, not the press, not the bitterness or the division. What will remain are the Sunday afternoons in the library, his voice quoting Tennyson, the way he folded his newspaper with surgical precision, the letter he left me, the trust he placed in me, the life he lived with dignity and grace. And now, this house. My house. I leaned against the column, looked up at the stars slowly unveiling themselves above the trees, and whispered, "We did it, Grandpa. We made it matter." The night was quiet, the air warm, and for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more real-life inspired stories about family, legacy, and resilience. Click the bell so you never miss a new video. And if you think someone else needs to hear this, share it with a friend. There's always more to uncover in the next story.